if we're looking now, what you're trying to do is look for a set of abstractions that's adequate to the purpose of explaining parapsychological effects and reincarnation, whatever. So what you're trying to do is try to put together a set of abstractions that are adequate for that purpose.
Yes, but I'm actually doing a little bit more than that.
Okay.
Right? Because that's the occasion for these lectures, and so it's important. But in order to have a set of abstractions adequate to that purpose, I think it also has to be adequate to other domains, right? So it has to be adequate, first of all, to common sense. Whitehead says every philosophy should ultimately justify itself to common sense. Right? If the philosophy doesn't explain to us why we're conscious and why we have a purpose, it's useless. It just doesn't adequate, right? And also for us at this particular historical time, any set of abstractions that we're going to take seriously has to be adequate to science. It has to be adequate to this remarkable 400 years of work and data that we've accumulated. It has to explain that also, right? So it's not just a particular theory for this domain, because what I'm suggesting is that the need to explain this is not isolated. That we're in the midst of a crisis of consciousness on the planet, and that we need to explain not just reincarnation and life after death. We need to explain what the hell's going on in a much broader way. And so these ideas in general are meant for broad application, but they are adequate to this domain, which is why there's the occasion for talking about it in this way, and why we're emphasizing parapsychology, because it's really interesting. And again, the work on science and daily life and so forth has been done by others, Whitehead notably, and Sri Aurobindo and me and some of my other work.
Going back to the original idea that experience has to be the basis,
yes,
along with common sense for understanding science, anything along those lines. I really understand everything that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
How does one move from understanding to experience of what you're talking about? In other words, if I hold this cup up in front of me, how do I go from understanding it being a series of events to experiencing that cup as a series of events?
It's interesting because in Vipassana meditation, for example, they actually talk about becoming so acutely conscious that it's possible to discriminate the separate events. And they talk about how it's even possible to discriminate the separate events of one's own ongoing existence, which apparently is quite frightening. There's a whole literature about dealing with that. Right? So there does seem to be a yogic dimension to this. But what I had in mind was a little more ordinary, right? Which is just learning to think this way. There's something, for me, it's like really fascinating. You know, it's like, so I imagine the events, right, the atomic and the molecular events, right? And I sort of imagine the quantum particles collapsing, and I imagine sort of the atoms and stuff happening, right? It's all happening. And then there's this other thing, the form. And then I sort of feel the form, right? I'm not really feeling the form, because I'm really feeling the events, right? But it's so odd. It's something so clear and crystalline. And then I imagine that every one of these little atoms is somehow, Whitehead would say, prehending, or apprehending, or feeling. Each one of these atoms is feeling the whole form of the cup and saying yes to it. Right? So all these little atoms say, oh, cup. I don't use that word, right? But they somehow feel the form. And so to think that the events, the living events that are taking place right here, it's totally alive, right? And they're all together deciding on the cup, moment to moment, and inviting it in, the cup form. It's just to think that way is really different. And it's just like, so I sort of picture the cup like being held in place by all these little decisions, and it's kind of beautiful, right? And then I start to feel how the form of my body is brought into being by my decisions, and so it shifts the way things seem.
In this context, you're describing the form, your form, versus the form of the cup and the atoms coming together. Where is the relationship there? In other words, you as the observer and an observer, a broader observer, is the observed and the observed, the observer and the observed arising together in that relationship? In other words, there's a form and then your experience of the form. There's a relationship there.
Yes, there's a form and there's an experience of the form. So in each moment of my existence, I discern possibilities, which are forms. And I decide which form will become actualized in me. Whitehead would say, I decide which form becomes ingredient in me or ingresses in me. So I do that about the decisions that I have to make. I don't have to decide about the cup. The cup already did that. The cup events already invited in the cup form and then transmitted it to me. And then I decide what word to say or what gesture to make in relation to it. Right? So that the object is a subject and the universe is completely intersubjective. Not that the subject is as complicated as I am, it's simpler, but it is a subject in its own right. And it decides what form it will be, and I decide what form I will be. Does that make sense? It's a different way of thinking. Right? It's a different way of thinking.
It'd be interesting sometime to list the abstractions that would be necessary to include. Because the Newtonian, there's the idea of the little dead atoms,
Right.
and then say gravitational equations.
Right.
So those are
It's
not
one
adequate.
set. Right.
So then,
Yeah. Well, we can go through just briefly. I mean, just some of them. Right. We can start with the Newtonian, and then we can go the whole next phase of science, which is about energy and thermodynamics, and then the stage of science that was about probability fields and so forth. Right. So there have been these different metaphysical developments in science, but then also we have to do psychology, because every one of these events, even the subatomic events, has its own interiority, and therefore its own psychology. Right? So all the abstractions of psychology become involved. But then, of course, no entity is not social. Actuality is fully social, and so therefore all the abstractions of sociology, right, become involved, and all the abstractions of self-organization become involved, and so there's a very, very broad range. What Whitehead says is that each specific science works with its own particular set of abstractions, and that metaphysics is the critique of abstractions, and it's the attempt to frame a set of abstractions which allows us to integrate as much as is possible all the different special sciences. Not that that's ever fully possible, right? But that the quest to do so is wholesome and helpful, and that every civilization needs some set like that. And there's always a tension, right? There'll always be certain specific areas that will come up with abstractions that don't fit in to the metaphysical system, and that's a constant challenge. So it's a very dynamic process. It's an experimental process all the time. Does that get what you're talking about?
Yeah, psychology and sociology.
Yeah.
What really, if you're talking metaphysics of or whatever the purpose of the lectures you're giving, not only we have to go to the purpose of understanding reincarnation and other life after death, but we have to fit in all the not the abstractions themselves, I don't know how to put this, but we have to fit in all the facts that science has discovered, and psychology and everything. The more of those things that we can fit in, the more adequate this theory is going to be.
Exactly. I'm totally with you. Yes, 100%. Yes, that's the definition of adequacy.
Yeah.
Because what we're trying to be adequate to here is life, right? Not just to any specific technical domain. Right?
And the other thing that interested me in what you said is, that we need to find a new set of categories. And I think that this way of thinking, Whitehead's way of thinking, or not only Whitehead, but now I'm sitting at the course in Teilhard de Chardin and so on, there is, in order to understand reality through what they are saying, you have to really take some of the categories that we're using normally today in everyday discourse, like experience, feeling, and start using them in a different way. So we have to re-establish these categories.
That's right.
And that, I see it as just such a hard task.
It's challenging. It is challenging. Yeah, it's not easy. But we do have to do it. It's necessary because the old categories are no longer serving us. We must move into a new set of categories to make sense out of the experiences that we have to make sense out of, to make sense of the data domains that are relevant to our existence. We need a new set of metaphysical categories. Yeah.
When you talked about the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, and you said that some of the Eastern philosophies are grounded on this,
Yes.
on
Yes.
the fallacy, I was thinking, would you say that, for example, Zen is a
Yes.
kind of a discipline that is absolutely, they try to bring, this is something that I've been dealing with, is that what they try to do through the koans?
Yes.
To just break
That's
all
right.
this.
That's right. And in general, I would say that Zen, in particular, but also other forms of meditation, are an attempt to bring about an experience of actuality that is unmediated by abstraction. Right? A completely raw experience of actuality. Right? That seems to be what they're trying to do. So this idea, for example, in Patanjali of stilling the modifications of the mind. So the idea is to bring about a perfect passivity of the intellect, which means that that the intellect is not abstracting any characteristics from reality. Reality just is. And Pete Russell calls this the great experiment. The great experiment is to just still the mind. And everybody who's been capable of doing it, it's very, very hard to do, right? Says that they experience the absolute, that they experience the ground of all being, and that they experience themselves as identical with the timeless ground of all being. And this is the experience of liberation. That is the ultimately concrete. And that everything else is a set of abstractions from that. So what we experience is not an illusion, but it's an abstraction.
So where does personality go in there, where you are experiencing the absolute?
Well, now we're getting to some really heavy territory here, but there is a tendency among certain schools to say that there's the experience of the absolute, and then there's the experience of the relative, and that once you have the absolute, everything else is an illusion. Right? So they say that we are illusions, and that the objective of existence is for the illusion to realize it's an illusion, so it can stop being deluded. Right? Sri Aurobindo would say, no, once we realize that the absolute is the ultimately concrete, everything, it's not the absolute as opposed to the relative, it's the absolute and the relative all together in the concrete wholeness. And so then somehow it becomes possible for the personality to continue functioning as an ongoing process of abstraction in the light of the fact that, without misplaced concreteness. With no misplaced concreteness, there's no contradiction between the absolute and the relative. It's only if we absolutize one or either of those, one or both of those, that we get into trouble. Right? So, all right? Okay. Thank you.